Compared to Europe's past or Asia's present, territorial disputes in Latin America are few and far between. Still, some remain, which play a disproportionate role in the national myth of their respective countries and mask some really interesting histories that are not often talked about outside of those countries. To see why, join me for this brief look at the top territorial disputes in Latin America. Number 1. We begin with the one that probably plays the largest role in a country's national myth: Bolivia's dispute of Chile's possession of the Atacama Desert. The conflict has roots in the 1879 War of the Pacific, which itself occurred because of economic competition over the resources of the region. At the time, nitrates, important components of gunpowder, had been found in the area, but Bolivia, which owned the land, lacked both the manpower and the capital to exploit them. So they signed a deal that allowed Chile to develop the area at a given level of taxation and banned the raise of taxes on Chilean companies for 25 years. So naturally, when in 1878, Bolivia attempted to impose an additional 10-cent tax, it created conflict. This led first to the Chilean companies refusing to pay, and then to the Bolivian threat of nationalizing all of their property. Chile then decided to occupy Antofagasta, because from their perspective they were protecting the legitimate property of their citizens. Bolivia didn't see it that way, so they followed up with a declaration of war, confident that they would prevail, as they had a secret defensive pact with Peru for just such an occasion. Despite having superior numbers, the war was catastrophic for both Bolivia and Peru, but especially for the former because it not only suffered huge losses of men, but also lost the Atacama Desert, which made it permanently landlocked. The defeat left permanent trauma, and the reacquisition of the lost territory has been seen as a matter of national security and pride for over a century now. Hence, Bolivia's insistence on maintaining a navy, even though it is mainly limited to laps on Lake Titicaca. Likewise, each year the country elects a Miss Litoral, a beauty queen for its non-existent coastal province, and of course makes a big show of celebrating the anniversary of the death of one of the martyrs from the war, Eduardo Baroa Hidalgo, who according to Bolivian lore, when the surrounding Chilean troops demanded his surrender, he answered, "Rendirme yo, que se rinda su abuela, carajo," which translates to, "Me, give up? Let your grandmother give up, damn it." Meanwhile, politicians routinely blame the loss of the land for their underdevelopment and have tried for years to get international courts to rule in their favor. In 2018, the International Court of Justice finally ruled that Chile had no obligation to accommodate Bolivia's demands, but this has not stopped the Bolivians from reclaiming their lost land and probably won't for the foreseeable future. Number 2. Another competing claim that has played a disproportionate role in a country's national myth is the dispute over the Falkland Malvinas Islands. The controversy has deep roots. The British discovered the islands in 1690, but did not attempt to settle. Instead, the French did so first when they built Port Louis in 1764. Only 2 years later, the British constructed their own settlement, but whether they knew of the French village is unclear. Regardless, in 1766, the French gave up their claim to the Spanish, and 4 years later, the Iberians raided the British port, which nearly caused a war before both sides agreed to return to the status quo ante. This coexistence continued until 1774, when the British voluntarily left amid a global reentrenchment. The Spanish government followed suit in 1811, amid the Napoleonic Wars and general chaos in the mainland, so that only fishermen and other civilians remained in the islands. After gaining independence from Spain, Buenos Aires claimed the Malvinas, the Spanish translation of the name the French had given the islands, Îles Malouines, and dispatched a governor, Louis Vernet. His attempt to regulate fishing in the archipelago, however, created an incident with the Americans who resented some of their fishing ships being detained, and in response, one of their battleships, the USS Lexington, raided Port Louis in 1831 and took the island's leadership prisoner, declaring the islands free of government. Given the power vacuum, the British took the opportunity to reassert their control over the islands, something which Buenos Aires, headed at the time by the most dominant Argentine figure of the era, Juan Manuel de Rosas, immediately took issue with, filing a formal complaint, which has remained ever since. Lacking enough power or the will to do something about it, the complaint's intensity ebbed and flowed over the years, but became more of a central consideration after Perón took power and later during the global efforts at decolonization in the 1960s. It finally came to a head when in April 1982, the Argentine military dictatorship decided to invade the islands to bolster their reputation, which had been suffering because of economic troubles. No doubt, they thought it wouldn't be all that difficult since in the past there had been secret talks between the UK and Argentina about transferring the islands to the South Americans. Instead, it was disastrous for the junta. They lost 649 of their men, control of the islands, and the rule became impossible to sustain, leading to the return of Argentine democracy. Meanwhile, it had the opposite effect of what they intended. The British not only fortified the islands, but also granted the islanders citizenship and expanded their level of self-government. They also allowed a plebiscite in 2013 that asked them whether they wanted to retain their political status as a British overseas territory. The response was overwhelmingly in favor at 99.8%, so not much desire to join Argentina from the people living in the islands. From the Argentines' perspective, however, this is irrelevant since they're illegal occupiers in the first place, and so the dispute continues. Number 3. Another dispute which has roots in European colonial struggles is the Venezuelan claim to the Guyanan Essequibo, about 2/3 the size of what the Guyanan government administers. This quarrel is also several hundred years old. The Spanish were the first Europeans to make claims to most of the northern part of South America, based on their voyages of discovery in the 1490s. Indeed, the territory in their dispute is named after the first Spaniard to see the region, Juan de Esquivel. Their claims, however, were never followed with settlements, and about 100 years later, the Dutch began to colonize the area, a situation that infuriated the Spanish, not only because they saw it as encroaching on their territory, but even worse, it was occurring under the auspices of a non-recognized breakaway republic that was itself thought of as part of the Spanish crown domains. Some decades and a few wars later, in 1648, the Spanish signed the Munster Treaty, which recognized the Dutch Republic and its colonies in South America, but crucially, only the ones east of the Essequibo River. Nonetheless, the Dutch insisted on expanding west, settlements which the Spanish would destroy whenever they had the chance. Skirmishes between the two rival powers would continue until the Dutch transferred their possessions to the British in an 1814 treaty, but which also did not specify where the border to those territories was. Newly independent Gran Colombia and later Venezuela continued to make claims on the Essequibo and would complain regularly to British authorities about their encroachment. In response, the British tried to formalize the border and in 1840 commissioned a German-born botanist that had been exploring the area, Robert Schomburgk, to survey the boundary. Schomburgk promptly drew a line that went well beyond British occupation and placed it at the mouth of the Orinoco River, a ridiculous application from the Venezuelan perspective, to which they responded by again claiming all of the land west of the Essequibo River. All that did was bring a negotiation in 1850 where the two sides agreed not to colonize the area, but again without establishing any border. The boundary conflict remained frozen for decades, but it began to gain traction when gold was discovered in the area in the 1870s and would soon become a diplomatic crisis. Venezuela appealed to the United States, arguing the British colonies were a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The American President Grover Cleveland found this persuasive, and in 1897 forced the British to agree to the Treaty of Washington, an arrangement where both sides would agree to the appointment of an international panel with 2 Americans, 2 British, and 1 Russian person, who would presumably be neutral, and who would determine the boundary between British Guyana and Venezuela. In 1899, the International Tribunal, however, ruled mostly in favor of Britain, granting them nearly all the disputed land except the mouth of the Orinoco River. The Venezuelans were furious and argued that the British had improperly influenced the Russian arbitrator, all to no avail. Venezuela continued to dispute the Essequibo. Pérez Jiménez, the Venezuelan dictator, even planned to invade the territory in the late 1950s, but his toppling in 1958 prevented it. Instead, the country ended up submitting formal claims in the United Nations, and in 1966, there was a Geneva Agreement, which was a framework that intended to end the dispute. Problem was that there was disagreement on the meaning of what they had even agreed to. Guyana thought the framework established that Venezuela would have to prove that the 1899 treaty had been improperly decided, and absent that, the status quo would prevail. Venezuela thought that the document made the 1899 treaty explicitly null and void, and committed the two parties to reach a satisfactory agreement. Since then, Venezuela's insistence on the Essequibo claims have ebbed and flowed. In the 1970s, Venezuela declared a moratorium on them in order to promote cooperation between the two countries. In 2004, Hugo Chavez declared in a visit to Guyana that he considered the dispute to be finished. But in the 2010s, the country again objected, especially after the finding of oil within the disputed maritime area. In 2018, the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez sent the case to the International Court of Justice, which then ruled in 2020 that it had jurisdiction over the area. They are expected to adjudicate the case sometime in 2023, but it does not seem like Venezuela would accept the result if it went against them, and so it remains. Number 4. Something similar to the Venezuela-Guyana dispute happened with the next one, the Guatemala-Belize conflict. The Spanish were the first to map the area from the Yucatan Peninsula to the Isthmus of Panama, and they claimed all of it for the crown. They never bothered to settle what is now Belize, however, because it lacked the resources they were interested in, and thus their hold over it was tenuous. An inhabited land close to busy sea lanes carrying Spanish gold from the New World was a godsend for British privateers, and starting in 1638, they used the area as the base of their piracy operations. The Spanish tried several times to dislodge the Belizean colony but failed, and it continued to prosper, eventually diversifying to the harvesting of tropical woods like mahogany. Unable to remove them, the Spanish decided to grant them permission to cut timber as long as they paid taxes to the crown, but only in the northern half of what is now Belize. As time passed and the Spanish left Latin America, the Belizeans spread south. When independence came, Guatemala inherited the dispute, but the Guatemalan dictator, Rafael Carrera, finally agreed to recognize all of the British territory in 1859 in exchange for a road that would connect Guatemala City to the Caribbean. The road, however, was never built, so the Guatemalans declared the treaty null and void and would continue to claim the land for over a century, setting aside empty seats in their legislature with the name Belize, and various Guatemalan dictators threatening to invade. In 2008, there was finally an agreement to send their dispute to the International Court of Justice, but only if their people agreed via referendum. So in 2018, Guatemalans said yes, and in 2019, Belizeans followed suit. So now the ICJ will make a final determination, but it's unclear when. Number 5. The final dispute is one that has lost some of its past acrimony, but nonetheless it's interesting because it's based not so much on historical claims, but geographical ones. The claim in question is Nicaragua's reclamation of the San Andres and Providencia Islands, an archipelago about 125 miles from the Central American coast. Starting in the 17th century, various European powers contested the islands, including the Dutch, the English, and the Spanish. At one point, it was even a Puritan colony, and later the base of the infamous pirate Henry Morgan, notorious for plundering multiple Spanish cities, including Panama and Maracaibo. The Spanish eventually regained control and administered the territory first from the Captaincy General of Guatemala, which was the government that ruled Central America at the time, and later from the Viceroyalty of New Granada, as the crown reasoned that Bogotá, although much further away, had more resources and would be able to better defend the islands. When New Granada became an independent Colombia, the islands aligned themselves with the new country, and in 1928, the Esguerra-Bárcenas Treaty was signed, where Nicaragua recognized Colombia's sovereignty over the archipelago. And that's how things stood until the Nicaraguan Revolution toppled Somoza in 1979, and the Sandinistas insisted that given that Nicaragua was under U.S. occupation in the 1920s, the 1928 treaty was null and void since it was done under American pressure, and furthermore, geographically it made more sense for the islands to be under Nicaraguan sovereignty. In 2001, the case was referred to the International Court of Justice, which Colombia argued had no jurisdiction over the case. Nonetheless, in 2007, the court issued a preliminary decision, which it upheld in 2018, that granted the island sovereignty to Colombia, but modified the maritime borders in favor of the Nicaraguans, which the Colombians did not accept. This has caused problems for the locals, and the issue remains unresolved, especially as Nicaragua insists on expanding its maritime border even more. And thus we conclude. Thanks for watching.